Okay, chapter 14 in Leviathan. Hobbes begins by talking about the right of nature, and he makes a distinction between the law of nature and the right of nature. A law of nature, he says, is a general precept found out by reason, that is to say, invented by reason, right? Which a man is forbidden to do that which is destructive of his life, takes away the means of preserving the same, or to omit that by which he thinks he may be best preserved. So natural right or natural law is the thing, whatever we think is necessary for our own well-being, our own preservation, and so forth, okay? Every human being has the right to decide what is going to preserve his, her life. And as you see at the top of 621, as long as this natural right of every man to everything endureth, there can be no security to any man, how strong or wise soever he be, living at the time, which nature ordinarily alloweth men to live. Natural right is a good thing, but natural right creates problems, right? It makes everybody the judge of what is going to be best for them. And that's a problem. So we have to figure out some way of doing it. In other words, to go back to the idea of natural law, right? Reason has to discover a way of doing this. So, and Hobbes goes on to draw some conclusions from this. It is a precept or general rule of reason that every man ought to endeavor peace as far as he has hope of obtaining it, and when he cannot obtain it, that he may seek and use all helps and advantages of war. Hobbes makes peace-seeking primary. I'll be damned if I can tell why Hobbes makes peace-seeking primary. There's no chain of consequences that leads to that conclusion. I don't think. So he lays down this rule: seek peace and follow it. But there's no evidence in my way of looking at it. There's no evidence that that's actually necessarily a rational thing, right? I mean, what's rational is to obtain as much power as you can. At least that's what my colleague would tell you. So, yeah, and he goes on then. Sorry, I'm trying to do two things at once here again. From this fundamental law of nature, so seek peace and follow it, and from that law comes this consequence, right? That a man be willing when others are, so too, as far forth as for peace and defense of himself he shall think necessary, to lay down his right to all things, and be contented with so much liberty against other men as he would allow other men against himself, right? We're working up to the social contract. And Hobbes puts this at the end of the paragraph in, finally, biblical terms, right? The law of the gospel, whatsoever you require that others should do unto you, that ye do to them, which is not exactly what how the golden rule is laid down, right? Do unto others as they do unto you. But in Latin, in Latin, by the way, it's even worse, because look at what he says in the Latin. The law of all men, that which you would not have others do to you, don't do to them. Is how it is phrased, and we can parse the Latin more carefully sometime. So the social contract then requires giving up natural liberty, and it's a problem, but it's also an opportunity. This is where reason points us as far as Hobbes is concerned, right? So in terms of forming the social contract, you have to be bound by your own word, but bonds, this is in the second column on 621 at the end of that long paragraph, right? Bonds have their strength, bonds that have their strength, not from their own nature, for nothing is more easily broken than a man's word, but from fear of some evil consequence upon the rupture. So if this weren't a family show, I would say Hobbes has to posit the existence of some great big blanking thing sitting on you and watching you to make sure that you carry through your obligations. This is why sovereignty is so scary in Hobbes, okay? Because it's going to make you carry through to the things that you have agreed to do. Okay. So that's a social contract. 622, he lays out contract. And the will of the contractor. And this stuff, we can kind of skip over this a little bit. Go on to 624 though, right? Men are freed of their covenants in two ways. This is the first paragraph there. Either performing or being forgiven. So there is a corollary of that coming up, but I want to draw your attention right now to the second paragraph. Covenants entered into by fear in the condition of mere nature are obligatory. That is not what we say in law, right? A contract entered into fear legally is something that is not, we can't hold you to it. But Hobbes says, oh yeah, no, that's fine, right? In nature. Again, war is a condition of scariness, right? A condition of great fear, a great uncertainty. And so you have to agree to abide by the political rules that you and others lay down for yourselves. And yeah, you're scared. But the fact that you're scared does not make the contract void as it would in any civil situation. More importantly, right? Remember what Hobbes has said back on okay, curse me for this. Oh, right. On 620 and 621, right? And so Hobbes then on 624 draws this out. A covenant's to accuse yourself. No, sorry, bottom of 624, first column. A covenant not to defend myself from force by force is always void. You have the right to defend yourself. You always have the right to defend yourself. Even if you contracted it away, you have the right to defend yourself. So that is one of the absolutes. And he goes on to say, a covenant to accuse oneself without assurance of pardon is likewise invalid, okay? Think about civil rights, right? Think about the right against self-incrimination, right? This is where that comes from, the idea that you could be forced to accuse yourself without any security that you're going to be pardoned for it, right? So he's working a little bit to sort of refine the ideas that we have of what government is, to soften the kind of very harsh notions of sovereignty that he is instituting. But he's also sort of instituting or introducing things that are just the way they've always been done, in England. So quietly, right? Yeah. Okay, if you have questions about the rest of 14, then that's fine, but I want to move on to 17. Because 17 is where we really, the rubber starts to meet the road about the polity. So the point is that reason points us to covenanting, agreeing together to articles of incorporation, articles of polity creation, whatever they might be, the social contract. And because we know that we can take better care of ourselves if we do this than if we are in the state of nature and we have to defend ourselves all the time. So, and this is what he says, the first paragraph of chapter 17, right? The final cause is the foresight of our own preservation and a more contented life thereby. And for Hobbes, again, this is important because this is what leads to industry, science, knowledge, improvement of the human condition, right? Again, nature sets challenges for us. So, yeah, well, so there. But this is why, right? Because the human passions are very powerful. And so you need, as he says on 633, second column, right? You need the terror of some power to cause them to be observed. We chafe at constraint. And so having some big mother out there who can really lay it on for you is the thing that Hobbes says you absolutely have to have. You just can't do without it. You can't govern people. He goes on. 634 is interesting because Hobbes is telling the story of sociable animals, right? Bees and so forth. And he says, and he gives several reasons why that's an imperfect analogy. And you can read those. I mean, I think they're clear. Not that Hobbes is a clear writer, but relatively speaking, they're clear. But I love this fifth one, right? On second column, 634. Whereas man is then most troublesome when he is most at ease, for it is then that he loves to show. For then it is that he loves to show his wisdom. Human beings are proud, stubborn, strong beings, and that's what makes government such a problem. So the only way to erect this big mother who's sitting on all of us, the only way to erect such a common power as may be able to defend them from the invasion of foreigners and the injuries of one another, and thereby to secure them in such sort as that by their own industry and the fruits of the earth they may nourish themselves and live contentedly, is to confer all their power and strength upon one man or upon one assembly of men, that may reduce all their wills by plurality of voices into one will. That's the sovereign. For Hobbes, that is the central point of all of this, right? Where does sovereignty come from? Well, it comes from agreement. What kind of agreement? Well, it's an agreement that's actually grounded in the fear that we're not going to be able to govern ourselves, that we're all going to be able, we're just all going to kill each other. And it comes from, oh, look what I did. And it comes from this idea, this ambition that people have, that maybe they can improve their lot by agreeing to some restraint, some constraint on their power. So you give it up completely. You give up all of your natural rights, right? Except self-preservation. And that is the essence, that is the core of the sovereignty that lies at the basis of the political community. Yeah, so sovereigns and subjects. And as I said yesterday, Baudin and other people are also coming to something kind of like this view of sovereignty, Baudin in France. But they're not drawing it from nature in the way that Hobbes is. So this is why Hobbes is really revolutionary. So rights of sovereigns by institution. So understand that there is no contract with the sovereign power. Okay, so you got this big mother sitting on you, right? You don't have a contract. You have no control over what that big thing is doing or may do, which makes it scary, right? But for Hobbes, that's the only reason you would obey, is because it's scary. And if it's not scary, you're not going to obey it, right? If you know what's happening, if you know what's going to take place in 2 years or 5 years or whatever, you're just not going to pay attention to it. So, yeah. So understand that you don't have a contract with them, right? For Locke, it's different. For Locke, the sovereign power is also a contracting party, but for Hobbes, not. Okay, so you have no agreement with them about how they're going to behave or anything like that. Your agreement is with all of the other people who are the subjects, but not with them. That's the main point there. He says this explicitly on 636, right? Secondly, because the right of bearing the person of them all is given, right? The covenant only one another, and not of him to any of them. There can happen no breach of the covenant on the part of the sovereign. Okay, so the sovereign can never break an oath, can never break the social compact. So that he which is made sovereign maketh no covenant with his subject beforehand is manifest. So, and then he's got conditions on sovereignty, and you can read those, and those are important. Right, the end of this, right? The end of the institution is peace. This is in the 5th condition, top of 637. It belongeth of right to whatsoever man or assembly hath that hath the sovereignty to judge both of the means of peace and defense, right? So it's their job to best decide how to defend the Commonwealth against its enemies. The 7th one gets us into modern capitalism. It leads directly to Locke, right? Is annexed to the sovereignty the whole power of prescribing the rules whereby every man may know what goods he may enjoy and what actions he may do without being molested by any of his fellow subjects. And this is it men call propriety. Hobbes uses an old-fashioned term instead of property. We would say property. Notice that property is not just goods. Property is this whole complex of rights that we have. Um, Locke kind of narrows the meaning of property down to just goods and things that you own. Whereas for Hobbes, it's a much broader thing. Yeah, so pay attention to that and sort of think about that as we move toward Locke, which we'll do next week. Laws of honor. I mean, this is the lastly, right, in on 638. Lastly, which is not my favorite word. My favorite word in here is 11thly. Lastly, he says, considering what values men are naturally apt to set upon themselves, right, there have to be public laws of honor. Hobbes is very much an Englishman here, right? Setting out what honors, what hierarchy is in the community. A public rate of the worth of such men as have deserved or are able to deserve well of the commonwealth. So, you make them a duke or something like that, right? If they deserve really, really well. And so sovereignty is absolute, is not limited by the contract, because the sovereign is not part of the contract. And so the sovereign sets out the terms, the conditions of good order in the polity. And that's probably enough to say about that. And then we'll finish up with 21. Liberty of subjects, right? So what is liberty? Well, very simply for Hobbes, it means being able to choose what you do or how you do it. And so, and you notice what he says, right? I mean, the inability to do something is not liberty, or is not, yeah. But you see, when the impediment of motion is in the constitution of the thing itself, we use not to say it wants the liberty, but the power to move. Okay. So again, Hobbes is, I said last time, Hobbes is, using our time before last, Hobbes is using these definitions, right? He's trying to be very precise, very geometrical in the ways that he describes these different abilities of human beings, and in the things, in the terms that he uses to create political philosophy and put it on a solid basis. So he's concerned that liberty is a very slippery concept. And he goes on 649, I'm going to anticipate a little bit here. On 649, he goes on, right, to talk about, well, first he talks about how the Greeks and the Romans have misled us about what liberty is. Because he understands, right? Okay, I'll talk about what's on 648 first. He understands that our choices are constrained in many ways. Every act of man's will, in the middle of the second column on 648, every act of man's will and every desire and inclination proceedeth from some cause, and that from another cause in a continual chain, whose first link is in the hand of God, the first of all causes, and therefore they proceed from necessity. Well, that's interesting, right? Because it suggests that free will is an absurdity. And remember, he says that very early on. Free will is an absurdity. Free will doesn't exist. It's all necessity. It's all caused by something else, and it is all ultimately caused by God. Again, we can unpack whether you think there's a contradiction here, right? Whether Hobbes really means that, or whether he means that, because if God sets out the conditions for us, then maybe God constrains us in ways that we don't know. You see what I'm saying? So I think we have to we have to be very careful about taking any of these things at face value. Because if everything follows from everything else, then freedom is problematic, and freedom may not exist. But Hobbes wants to say that freedom does exist. So how can he be saying both? The liberty of a subject, he goes on, right? The liberty of the subject is only to be able to do the things that the sovereign has said that he can, or has not said that he can't, right? Which is what he said, the liberty of a subject, 649, middle of first column. Liberty of a subject lieth therefore only in those things which in regulating their actions the sovereign hath pretermitted, that is to say, left out. But what Hobbes is talking about, and where he thinks that the Greeks and Romans have been misleading, is that there is a concept. John Rawls in the 20th century will talk about this as the liberties of the ancients versus the liberties of the moderns. For the Greeks and the Romans, liberty meant the liberty of the corporate body, the political body of the community. Think of the Athenian assembly, right? So when they talked about liberty, they were talking about the liberty of that corporate group, not the liberty of individual Athenians, not the liberty of individual Romans, right? And so this is what Hobbes means on 649, the liberty whereof there is so frequent and honorable mention in the histories and philosophy of ancient Greeks and Romans, blah, 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 is not the liberty of particular men, but the liberty of the commonwealth. So that's important. I mean, understanding the difference between liberty understood as individual liberty and liberty understood as corporate liberty, that creates interesting issues, interesting problems for political theory. And he goes on to talk about that then on 650. So understand that for Hobbes, there's no such thing as a right of revolution. We have no, once we've agreed, and that's it, right? So because there is a covenant, and Hobbes doesn't have a very good explanation. In fact, I don't think he has any explanation of how we're bound by old covenants, right? Things that our parents or grandparents or great-grandparents might have agreed to. But Locke has more of an account of that, although even Locke is not very satisfying on that score. So still, for Hobbes, there is no right of revolution. Okay, and property rights. There is one condition, however, finally, on 652, right? The obligation of subject to the sovereign is understood to last as long and no longer than the power lasteth by which he is able to protect them. Now, what does that mean? Well, it means protection from foreign enemies, of course, but it also means, as Hobbes has articulated already, it also means protection from domestic enemies, right? Protection from all of those other people who want to take advantage of you by force, by fraud, by some means, because that's what you signed up for in the first place, right? There's no need of a sovereign if the sovereign is not going to be the big mother who sits on everybody and makes them obey, okay? And if the sovereign is incapable of doing that, then you have no obligation to obey. Sovereign can force you into obedience, but yeah. So, and as he goes on to say, then bottom of the last paragraph, right? If the sovereign is defeated in war, your obligation is automatically transferred to the new sovereign, because the new sovereign now clearly is in charge because he won the war. So as Locke will say, it's clearly God's judgment that he should be that. Okay, I think I've left out a lot. I know I've skipped over quite a bit, but I'm going to leave it there, and hope that you all have a good rest of your day. And as I say, be active in the chat room and ask questions and so forth. All right, thanks. Bye.